Thank you.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Yeah.
Pretend there's a campfire on there.
Campfire. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. It's an honor to be here speaking before this group. My name is Sobczak. I'm a hydrologist here at the preserve, and the title of my talk is The Hydrology of the Big Cypress Before Canals and the Myth of the Rain-Driven Swamp. About the authors. This started about 2 years ago. There's Tony and I on the L28 canal. And shortly before this, Tony had just arrived back to the preserve, and we made a welcome home cake for him. And one of the first things he ran into is the L28. And the previous photo was taken on the L28 because L28 used to be the canal or levee in the middle of nowhere. All of a sudden, it had become Grand Central Station of the swamp. So that photograph, the first photograph, we were out there looking at preparations being made for emergency releases. Lo and behold, 3 months later, or a few months later, we got word that the Corps of Engineers was doing a study on it. And that's another author, Keefe. She's leading that study. It's called the Western Everglades Restoration Plan work. And then once Mike caught word that we were, messing with his swamp, he chartered a flight in to the Big Cypress, landing in Gum Slough. He had a little bit of a walk to get to the L28. And then the linchpin to all this, the Big Cypress Before Canals, dates back to a conversation with Jack Meeder, one of Mike's old cohorts during the 1976 Audubon Report days. And I had this conversation. It took me 10 years to understand it, but when I did, it finally all clicked. So moving on, what do we mean by pre-drainage? The answer, we're going to just jump to it, prior to post-drainage. Right? So, I'm going to move past this slide. In 1998, when I arrived here, oh, by the way, there's the L28 on the map. That's where Tony and I were standing on the levee. That's where Keefe was standing on the other side of the levee. That's where Mike landed in the helicopter in Gum Slough. And this is what Jack was talking about, that area up there. Okay, Slough. So proceeding, when I got here in 1998, watershed, right? Everybody told me that the preserve is a watershed, and it's a self-contained, rain-driven watershed that flows unfettered as sheet flow to the mangrove coast. And here's a sky view. It's a hydrologic brigadoon here at the preserve, right? We're just how it's just supposed to be. Nature intended it. Sky view, we get rain, the sole input to the estuary coast. And there's the rain falling on the preserve. And a ground view of this watershed is in the Big Cypress. The idea is water naturally flows through strands and sloughs, uncontrolled by gates to estuaries to downstream ENP. That was what we were established for as a watershed. So where did we get this story that we're a watershed? It's our 1974 origin myth. Everyone knows the story, or most people here do, that they were going to build a big jet port in the middle of the Big Cypress swamp. And they would have done it. And the L28, here's a brochure for it, the L28 would have actually been not only a water management feature, but a transportation feature to get to that huge jet port. Look how big that jet port is compared to Miami International Airport. And they would have done it. They actually built one of the strips. And had they built it, it wouldn't have been Vicey, it would have been an airport on Tony's cake. And quite frankly, he would have been running away. But they didn't build it because there was the intervention by conservationists. Joe Browder led the way. He teamed up with many, including Marjorie Stone and Douglas, and it resulted in a flurry of an outcry at a local, state, national level, and a flurry of environmental studies that determined that if this supersonic jet port were built, not only would it be the end of natural flows into the western estuarine arm of Everglades National Park as we knew it, it would also spell the end of the Big Cypress swamp with all the development that would occur. So instead of just preserving that little box there, and by the way, that little box is a big box. It's 6.5 by 6.5 miles, 39 square mile area. But instead of just preserving that one area and saying you can't build a jet port, the entire watershed was, the preserve was carved out as a watershed. Thus, the watershed myth began. Yes. Factors that fed the monster myth, is physiographical. The L28 has historically been this out-of-the-way canal that's been interpreted as an inert feature at the natural boundary between the Everglades and swamp. And when you look at maps like these, it's easy to believe that. Oh, look, yeah, the L28 is pretty much at the physiographic boundary, doesn't do any harm. The other factor is physiographic is the Immokalee Rise forms a hydrologic boundary to the north. And sure enough, it's a mountain. Jack Meeder calls it Immokalee Mountain. There's the mountain. There's no way water's getting around that, right? It's too high. It's 42 feet above sea level. And then on our left, State Road 29 canal, historically we kind of looked at that with a blind eye that it's drainage from Immokalee. And the original boundary of the preserve did not include State Road 29, so that kind of blended to that mindset. And finally, the last physiographic factor is the swamp mosaic contains smaller and less connected flow systems. In the river of grass, you can really see the direction of flow. It's a little more of a labyrinth in the preserve and seasonally wetlands. Historical factors that fed the myth. Oh, the preserve lies out the CNSF project. That's the big Army Corps project. So, okay, we're outside the project, therefore we not only we escape the harm of that big project, so the thinking goes, but we also don't get the spoils of all the water management that goes into that. So nothing common. So hydrologically, we're much less impacted than the KOE ecosystem. In maps like this, which are rife through the literature, through the Everglades community, kind of propagate that sensation that, oh, Big Cypress never changed over time. So the swamp has been regarded, even by Everglades experts, on the East Coast, that it's as close as you get to pre-drainage conditions. And it's celebrated for that reason. You can see this shows over time that a lot of other places changed in South Florida, but not the preserve. So psychologically, the myth worked. We love the myth. It makes us feel good. We're a hydrologic brigadoon. We're a watershed. We did it right, unlike the nasty Everglades that depends on, water management machinations and the befouling of the water. We got all our rain from the sky. It was expedient, right? Sometimes if you're carved out as a watershed, it simplifies the matrix. There's a definition of expedient. I won't read it. But most of all, it's what we were told. Can you see the stork? The stork bring us the preserve. And that's the story we were told. You believe the story you're told when you're a child. I believed in Santa Claus until I was 12 age. Who told us this story? The Giants told us this story. That's why, on the left, Mike Duever told us this story, sort of. We'll argue about this later. Klein from the USGS. It was in the enabling legislation that Ford signed, and the foundational literature, the GMPs, et cetera, for the preserve told us this. But it really dates back to Klein. In 1970, he was commissioned with this flurry of reports to study the Big Cypress. If we're going to not have a jet port here, what do we have to preserve? And how did he delineate his watershed? He came up with this watershed for the Big Cypress Basin, from which the Big Cypress National Preserve was carved out. So he had it divided into ABC sub-watersheds, with the portion of C being that upstream watershed that he identified as feeding into downstream Everglades National Park, the estuarine arm. So how did he determine this? He looked at Davis's 1943 map, vegetation, and said it wasn't detailed enough. So instead he used aerial photography and stereoscopic mapping to delineate the watersheds. And this area C in particular is what initially was the focus. And he said here that some area C is drained naturally. It's primarily drained naturally, except for two canals, the State Road 29 and Turner River Canal. And then his recommendation, or his work, fed into the Jetport Advisory Board report, which identified an area that would become the future preserve, or original boundary of the preserve. It was proposed to be a parkway, and then the rest of the land protected by the state. Then it was going to be a recreational area. They were flopping around different ideas. The last proposal was a freshwater reserve. Then the state kicked in $40 million for land acquisition, and they designated the Big Cypress area of critical concern, and that was the catalyst for Public Law 93-440, which initiated or established Big Cypress National Preserve in 1974. And that was the area that feeds into the downstream western arm of Everglades National Park. So, and in the enabling legislation, all that information from Klein's report is espoused. Hydrologic, that it's a watershed, that the area remains relatively undisturbed, that it forms a nearly complete hydrologic unit. So that's the watershed myth. So here's the reality of what happened in 1974. In the late 60s, that's the size of the Jetport. They started building the L28. The engineers wanted to build it continuous all the way up to the agricultural area, but they discovered water was flowing the wrong way. It was sloughing off the Big Cypress. Engineers often discover that, by the way. I see it all the time. So they built a tieback canal. They tied the tieback to the Pinelands so they could steer the water out of the Big Cypress into the Everglades. And then the next step was they wanted to drain Cowbell Strand to decrease that, so they built the interceptor. These are really long levees. The interceptor at the top is 18 miles plus 5 miles. So they rerouted the water, and it even drains groundwater out of the preserve, and that was 1968. So the preserve inherited an altered landscape. I guess no surprise, really, in retrospect. That whole area of Mullet Slough drains pretty much wholesale into Water Conservation Area 3. Meanwhile, the tieback blocks water getting into the Sweetwater Strand, and the canal then sloughs water down to the Cape Sable seaside sparrow habitat, which further restricts how they can release water from the Everglades. There's a couple structures up there, I don't want to get into details on that. But in essence, the L28 was designed to help convey water on the right-hand side and help convey land, drain land, on the left-hand side, the preserve. So when Klein identified his watershed, he never factored in the impact of the L28 on the drainage, nor was it necessarily his, we'll get to this later, that wasn't his orders that he was given for his report. Okay, we're not a self-contained rain-driven watershed, we're a truncated and canal-drained watershed, right? But that's not what's surprising. That's not what's surprising. We know we're crisscrossed by canals. We know we point discharge to tide. We know 20, 30,000 acre-feet is running right out to tide here, halfway creek per year. We know these channels connected to tide cause saltwater to intrude even 5 miles inland through various channels. We know at our headwaters that the West Feeder cuts off our headwater flows, and it's routed around the preserve and down into the Everglades. Here's a look at it. And we know OK Slough is cut off by State Road 29 from getting into the Panther Refuge. And we know these arrows, we believed in these arrows, but it's not what's happening. These red lines represent flow barriers. Flow is not happening enough or at all across these boundaries. Meanwhile, we're discharging that vital surface water down these channels, and even during the dry season, we're losing groundwater down these channels. Again, that's not surprising. Not surprising. What was surprising was what we found in this McPherson report from 1966. He took Davis's map and he converted it into hydrographic units. He was going down the path to the castle of pre-drainagement enlightenment. He was. But he got caught in the dragon's den lair of the self-contained watershed, because in that same report, this figure was produced, and I call it the jelly bean. He drew a map around all the different areas of the Everglades, And the Big Cypress kind of, the physiographic area got what I call the jelly bean, often gets confused. The red often gets confused with Klein's Big Cypress watershed and the ENP watershed. We talk about all three synonymously. But here's the real clicker, and this is where it all fell together, or perhaps fell apart, is that the blue and the green are both, drum roll, can anybody guess? What are the blue and the green? They're both post-drainage. They're both post-drainage delineations. Hit the symbol again. The pre-drainage Big Cypress has never been defined in the Everglades. It simply hasn't. It's never been defined. So the biggest Everglades restoration meme that they have out there is this before, now, and aftermath. This is what everyone uses as kind of at a general level to understand where we were, where we're at now, where we're going. But that's really just for the KOE system, Kissimmee, Okeechobee, Everglades. For the Big Cypress, all we have is current flow. We've never differentiated these flows from a pre-drainage or an aspirational pathway for what we want in terms of restored flow. So what is pre-drainage and what is restored flow? That's where Kelly Keefe, with the work study, sat us down and she gave us a homework assignment. She said, I want you to write an essay on how the swamps connect to Lake Okeechobee. So everybody thought we were going to come in and slay the rain-driven dragon. No, we want to be the very best rain-driven watershed we can be, but we also need to know how we were connected with our headwater flows and how we can, and what they were. So that's when I remembered this conversation with Jack Meeder that took me 10 years to understand. And what he kept saying is, Bob, when I was looking at the Duever report, I kept focusing, this isn't a timeline of the Big Cypress of infrastructure, water management features. He said, I kept focusing on this area here. The biggest change in the Big Cypress occurred with Hamilton Distant. I always thought that was just kind of put there as kind of a literary starting point, and it really didn't have much effect. But we started to look at it. Unfortunately, it was before science began to record science began to record the freshets of, I'm missing this one, but you know what I mean. There's no data. Well, hold on tight, because this is Danforth Hardy. Danforth Hardy, our friend, is going to take us on a journey into the history. So here's Danforth Hardy. Everybody always focuses, this is up on Lake Okeechobee, everybody focuses on the sentinel tree, right? Let's focus on Danforth Hardy here. Everybody ignores him. There's the sentinel tree now. Danforth Hardy just fell 10 feet and going to the modern system. Now, here he is on the Caloosahatchee. He's in a canoe. He's a powerful man. Powerful man. He's canoeing up the falls, 5 to 10 feet, Fort Thompson Falls. And you see where he is? Before the falls were blown up, the Caloosahatchee River Valley was flooded. Lake Flirt, Lake Bonnet, Lake Ochopee. And that raised the water table on the north side of the Immokalee Rise. Therefore, the Immokalee Rise, when rain fell on it, it all discharged south. Groundwater-fed swamp. So there he is. There's Danforth Hardy. He's up on Lake Flirt right now. He is loving life. All that discharge is now discharging south from the Immokalee Rise, from Lake Flirt, going into the Big Cypress. There he is on a vertical scale. Now Hamilton Distant went through and dredged it and put in also spreader canals. In the history of the Caloosahatchee, there were nautical interests and there were drainage interests. Can anyone guess who won? They both won. It's the mother of all drains. It was such, so Danforth Hardy used to be up there at 15, let's say 20 feet above sea level. He fell 15 feet. The modern elevation there is 3 feet above sea level. And of course it washed him out the top too. But we're not done with Danforth Hardy. We always talk about subsidence to the east, and we focus on the Everglades agricultural area. Water used to flow over the lake, but then they built the levee, and it subsided to the south. So that's how we kind of conceptualize it. But if we think about, there's the lake, there's Immokalee Mountain, the Sawgrass Plain. When we lost that sawgrass sponge, not only did we lose that slow trickle for water going into the Everglades, it collapsed the groundwater table under the Immokalee Rise. Those seeps went dry. Let's send Danforth down into the Everglades. Here's at the river grass. Okay, that didn't get touched. But even most of the ridge and slough subsided by 1 to 2 feet, even more, because of subsidence, oxidation fires. So the reality is, here's Klein's map. Here's the original watershed, the green that he drew. But if we add the lake, he did his job. He was just looking at what the drainage was currently for the Big Cypress. He wasn't thinking historically, and not a lot of new information came to light with that regard. So if we put the lake back at its pre-drainage level, 10 feet above sea level, the Everglades agriculture area at least 5 feet higher, if not more. Lake Flirt, 15 feet higher in terms of water level. There's the Immokalee Rise. That's the old groundwater table. And anyhow, and if you raise up the Everglades, water would have actually flown from the lake and entered into the modern day preserve. So historically, we received water from the lake. Here's a big surprise though, Mullet Slough. We think of Mullet Slough naturally flowing into the Everglades. At this higher topographic condition, Everglades is actually flowing into the Big Cypress. We received water from the Everglades, not vice versa through Mullet Slough. All that water was contained in the preserve. And then the modern day rendition of Ochopee Slough is at some point it starts flowing north. Back under this condition, it never flowed north. Ochopee Slough was the seep at the base of the Immokalee Rise. The groundwater seep flowed south, fed the preserve. So the original pre-drainage watershed of the preserve reached nary up to the Caloosahatchee, with the Caloosahatchee being a hydrologic boundary condition that helped feed groundwater into the swamp. So if we do a simple endpoint analysis using McPherson's map here, it does the same thing. We run that line, the line at the northeast corner of west corner of the preserve, goes around Thackahachie and then runs up to the Caloosahatchee. So that's the pre-drainage watershed we propose for the Big Cypress. So Big Cypress restoration map meeting. This is what we need for the Big Cypress. We've never had it. It tells us where we were and where we need to go, where we're at now. So here's kind of a representation of that. You can see we're actually a primary source of the swamp were the seeps flowing off of the Immokalee Rise through Ochopee Slough, Devil's Garden, Corkscrew, Swamp Seep. Also, Mullet Slough all turns into the preserve, and the Everglades are feeding the swamp, not vice versa. But let's think metaphorically. Think of the pre-drainage swamp as a hydrologic cathedral. So here's what it was like in 1870, a very complex flow pattern you could kind of think of as a cathedral. Well, the dredging and draining of the Caloosahatchee knocked off the tap. The leveeing of the lake knocked off more. The subsidence in the Everglades sloughed off more water. The CNSF project, Ochopee Slough diversion, Southern Golden Gates. What we're left with today, our conservation lands are kind of collapsed ruins of pre-drainage past. So our current condition, we're really remnants or ruins of a flowway that was once fed by multiple sources, one of the primary ones being groundwater, that are now dormant, don't exist. We're only rain-driven because it's the only thing left. So here's our meme. So pre-drainage, if it was a cathedral, and our current condition is that. This isn't a depressing story. What does our restored flow condition have to be? Well, we can rebuild these. If we put the right keystones in the right places, we can rebuild our headwater architecture. And it's just a matter of putting those in the right places, and we can rebuild something, our hydrologic flowways that connect us to our remnant upstream watersheds. So metaphorically, this is what our map meme should be for the Big Cypress. But I propose that we have to take the next step and actually come up with the figures that then we can start to, the actual maps to put in those places in tandem with this. So 2 examples, Ochopee Slough. The status quo is an abomination in terms of water quality and not getting water to the ecosystem. There'll be no meaningful restoration in the Big Cypress without getting Ochopee Slough right, where it connects to the Panther Refuge and into the preserve. If we put the keystone there and then we rebuild this arch, we're sending water across the landscape instead of just sloughing it down. And yes, it's expensive. It requires a pump station, stormwater treatment areas, infilling of the canal. But all major water management in South Florida happens in tandem with other development. So there is some other development and road widening come up there. We really have to be proactive and embrace that and highlight that the only solution is the biggest solution, and guess what? It works for everybody. And then there's little examples like Halfway Creek. If we put a plug in there, then we can spread the water out in combination with some other features. So summary points is the pre-drainage swamp was part of a much bigger watershed than we previously conceived. It was groundwater fed. It was a groundwater fed swamp from the Immokalee Rise. Today it's groundwater drained. We have a groundwater drain swamp. The pre-drainage swamp was surface water fed from Lake O, the Everglades, and Ochopee Slough. Today it is drained into the Everglades and to tide. And it was wetter longer. We probably had 2 to 3 times as much flow moving across the Tandamic Trail, across the landscape that we do now. The post-drainage swamp overview. The Caloosahatchee was and is the mother of all drains in South Florida, and that includes its effect on the Big Cypress. Big Cypress is rain-driven because rain is the only thing left. Our remnant headwater flows flow around, not through the swamp. We see that on the L28s, we see it at State Road 29. And today's spring droughts, what we think of as a natural, normal spring drought is actually an artifact of drainage, not natural. We'd have a dry dam, but we never had top dry dams where we turned into a tinderbox. So moving forward, I propose we need to revise and build upon our swamp as a rain-driven watershed. Yes, we're more than rain-driven. We want to be the very best rain-driven watershed we can be, but we want to be connected to our headwaters too. We need to get our maps right. I think they're the primary mean through which we communicate where we're at now, where we were, and where we want to get. We just don't have those maps. So many of the maps for the Big Cypress do the hydrology a disservice or don't include this same before, now, after. And most of all, we have to renew water management as a top stewardship priority in the Big Cypress Swamp, not an afterthought. Not an afterthought. So the perils of staying put is, just run through this really quickly, we've spent over $70 million in the past 10 years fighting fire of an overdrained swamp. Fighting wildfires, and that $70 million equals 0 cents in terms of increasing the swamp's long-term natural resilience to fight drought. We have to balance our expenditures on fire with our capital investment into the water infrastructure. Because if we can't $70 million to put into water, I can't even quantify it because it would be priceless. It would be like a masterpiece we'd never seen, but it would be spread across the entire landscape. Thank you for your time.
Well, I'll allow one question. Does anybody want to risk it? I mean, I'm sure there are discussions. We'll have discussions at the break. Thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mark Danaher from the Fish and Wildlife Service, talking about ghost orchids. Oops, yes, Keefe. Where'd Bob go? Bob crushed my dreams about the rain-driven swamps. I mean, there's no Santa.
That doesn't look good.
Reminds me of the old days when the blue screen was always the bad thing when you're at a talk.
Oh, never.
Anybody have any questions for Bob?
Somebody must have a question.
hydrology.